All right, are we ready? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Family Services Family Partnership Center. Is this anyone's first time here? All right, I love first timers. Wonderful. Well, welcome. And what a year it is to talk about human rights. So you are in the right place. My name is Leah Feldman, and I'm the CEO of Family Services. And we are so honored to be hosting this event here this evening with our esteemed guests, Commissioner Miranda and Ms. Anna Fierst, and of course our Jody Miller from Dutchess County here. At Family Services, we exist to support everyone's right to thrive. You know, the work we do is really about supporting basic human rights, and we are governed by a variety of beliefs that I'm just going to read to you here because you are a room of people who understand them. So we believe at Family Services that you have the right to safety in your home, you have the right to positive mental health, you have the right to safe communities, you have the right to knowledge and empowerment, you have the right to opportunity and growth, you have the right to strong foundations, you have the right to access, and you have the right to hope. So this is how we govern our work at Family Services, because we truly believe that all of these are basic human rights. And this building right here, the Family Partnership Center, is one of the ways we demonstrate everyone's right to access and everybody's right to hope. Here, we are a visible, trusted hub for connection and belonging. Here in this building, families can access healthcare, legal services, food security, financial literacy, education, and advocacy, all under one roof. Because we know when we remove barriers to service, we really create opportunity for everyone. So I welcome you to this extremely important event here this evening, and I'm very pleased to turn it over to the Executive Director of Dutchess County's Commission on Human Rights, Jody Miller.
Thank you, Leah. Can everybody hear me? So I want to thank Leah and her team for their generosity in hosting us tonight. They've been amazing to work with. There's a special place in my heart for the Family Partnership Center and the work that Family Services does, having worked in this building myself for about 12 years when I ran a nonprofit agency. So I love to see the growth, the development, and thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So, check them out for the amazing work. So, how did we get here tonight? Well, as Leah said, this is a moment for human rights. And when we began talking about what this year would look like for the Human Rights Commission in Dutchess County, our team of commissioners, who some of whom are here tonight, Jennifer, Jenna, and Melissa, we have a team of about 15 volunteers that are appointed by the county executive and the chair of the legislature. But when we were talking about what we're doing this year, we thought it was so important to start with the foundation and lift up the history of this community in Dutchess County. And so what is that foundation? And we're going to talk about that tonight. We're happy, so thrilled to have both Commissioner Denise Miranda from the New York State Division of Human Rights. We're going to talk about what our agency does and how it lifts up and protects human rights here in New York State. And also Anna Eleanor Fierst, who's the great-granddaughter of Eleanor Roosevelt, whose home was right here in Dutchess County. And every year it has been important for our commission to lift up the work that Eleanor did, and in particular, the amazing legacy that she left with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we will touch on today. So, I want to thank you for coming tonight. We have been working for a couple of months now with the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Val-Kill, with the team there, Samantha and Stephanie, thank you very much, with the DHR, Division of Human Rights team, Peyton and Kelly, they're here somewhere, and they've been amazing, and Matthew's here as well. So it's been a fabulous collaboration, and I'm so pleased that we could do this. If you haven't seen the other two programs, they are webinars, and they are recorded on the Eleanor Roosevelt Center website. The Dutchess County Commission on Human Rights will also have them on our website soon. So without further ado, let me introduce properly Commissioner Miranda. and Anna Eleanor Fierst. Commissioner Denise Miranda, Esquire, was nominated by Governor Kathy Hochul and confirmed by the New York State Senate to lead the New York State Division of Human Rights, which is dedicated to eliminating discrimination, remedying injustice, and promoting equal opportunity, access, and dignity. Under Commissioner Miranda's leadership, the division has launched ambitious efforts to overhaul the agency's discrimination complaint, intake, and case management processes, while also implementing vital organizational changes and operational improvements. Again, thank you for being here tonight. And Anna Eleanor Fierst. Anna is a great-granddaughter of Eleanor Roosevelt and the daughter of Mrs. Roosevelt's oldest grandchild, Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves. Anna has a professional background in publication editing and marketing and managed communications departments at a national club. She joined the board of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center, ERVK, in 2019 to promote the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Her main goal now is to modernize one of ERVK's legacy programs and building support. She's a native of New York and Washington, D.C., and currently serves on a national organization promoting women's history, youth voting, and civic engagement, and she lives in Bethesda, Maryland. So thank you for being here tonight. So what we're going to do is we have some questions. I'll be asking the commissioner, and we're just saying Anna.
Anna's fine.
And asking them to talk about some questions, and we have some specific questions for each of them. And so it's a conversation, and then we will be opening it up for some questions and answers from all of you. So without further ado. So talking about human rights and leadership, how did Eleanor Roosevelt's leadership champion human rights for all, and how does the New York State Division of Human Rights champion human rights for all?
So I think when we're talking about the legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt, we're talking about a legacy that's rooted in civil rights platforms, right? And making sure that civil rights are not just an ideology, but something that people live and feel in their day-to-day. And I think here at the New York State Division of Human Rights, our commitment is to ensure that every New Yorker has an opportunity to access and afford themselves of all the opportunities that are available in New York State, right? And our jurisdiction is wide. We cover education, we cover employment, we also cover housing and public accommodation. Making sure that New Yorkers know that we exist is half of the equation. Knowing where to find us is the other part, and then trusting us, right, to commit to the job of making sure that discrimination really has no place here in New York. I think that's where you're really talking about the intersection of a historical legacy. You know, I'm very proud to say that New York State celebrated our 80th-year anniversary. Last year, we're the first state in the entire country to actually have a human rights law. So when you're talking about historical legacy and points of pride, I think there's really a lot of synergy there between the two.
Yeah, I just learned that in 1945. I mean, it's just amazing. Predates the UDHR, which was 1948. I'm going to treat that as a bookended question because it's at the beginning of her sort of political activism. I would date it to about the 1920s. She really got out there and decided that she needed to integrate herself into the political world in order to advance, of course, her husband's political career. He's sidelined by polio, as many of us know. So she began to really attach herself and become allies with people like Carolyn O'Day, who, again, was one of the first women in Congress from New York. She went around and she campaigned for Al Smith, who was a Catholic, and that was an issue. She said, the heck with that, you know, he's a good man. He was for progressive values. And that's kind of the way that she began her political activism, becoming almost, I call it, unpaid social worker. Gave many, many speeches on behalf of various issues, many of them concerned with, in that case, Women's Trade Union League, International Garment Workers Union. Some of those things came out of the Triangle Trade, the Triangle Fire. So she really sort of began to feel her way into this world that exploded in the 1930s, I think, once her husband became president. Then the other end of this, in terms of the other bookend, is about the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which happened Truman appointed her. She was reluctant at first, as some of us know. She really became the kind of the driving force behind the drafting committee, which created the UDHR, we just call it that. And when you look at those 30 articles, you really understand what the foundations were that the world was looking at in terms of what was out there, what do we rebuild from the shattered remains of the Europe and after World War II. So that was, I would say, in terms of human rights, it was almost, in her sense, national human rights, and then it evolved into, of course, the sense of global human rights with the Universal Declaration.
So it sounds like both of you were talking about the pioneering ways
Right.
that Eleanor Roosevelt and when the New York State Division, New York State Human Rights Law was passed in 1945, around the same time, 80 years, and both pioneers as human rights and in law.
I'd like to know sometime what was the driving force behind that, New York's law.
Oh, we'll definitely
Yeah,
get that.
get into that, yeah.
What I think that's also interesting, though, is to recognize that the human rights law is a living, breathing document, right? And where we
Right.
started from the perspective of employment, right? And ensuring that employment discrimination was no longer legal to where we are right now, with even recent amendments, right, that include gender expression. There's 19 protected classes in New York State, which really speaks volumes, I think to the history and the progressive values of this state, especially right now when we see what's happening on a national landscape. So we started 80 years ago, but we continue to evolve as we recognize how society has changed and how it hasn't in many ways and capacities, and making sure that we are keeping up with the evolution to ensure that vulnerable communities and communities that are marginalized have a place and a resource to go to if they experience discrimination. I think that's really something that we're very proud of, is that it didn't stop 80 years ago. That was really just beginning to the incredible trajectory.
And that really leads into my next question, is about discrimination and the evolution of how the New York State Division of Human Rights takes action with respect to discrimination. And Commissioner Miranda, you were just talking about it evolves as society is evolving and culture is evolving. And the same question, and if there's more that you could say about that, and also, you know, like what are some examples of how it's evolved? You just began to get some, and also how did Eleanor Roosevelt take action when she saw discrimination, when she witnessed that?
Yeah, I think until she really, so in the 20s, I think the way she took action was basically to build, and we'll get into this a little bit, about building allyships. And so she said, look, I don't have the knowledge, I'm just beginning to learn how to make public speeches without squeaking, and, you know, a modulated voice, how to get my message across, how to write speeches that were, so she got into attacking and looking and examining these issues, especially labor discrimination and labor protection laws for women workers. These are, you know, all coming, like Rose Schneiderman, she was a great associate of hers, Carolina Day, and many people, it is all the New York Division of Democratic Women. This was her base in the 1920s. And I think that by the time he was elected, she really had sort of a sense of, these are the areas that I can make a difference in, and how she could influence, for example, his programs, the Works Progress Administration. A lot of these things that happened in all states, not just New York, some of them were WPA, other things were civilian conservation programs. She would go back to Franklin and say, you know what, this isn't working here. And she was out on the road traveling tens of thousands of miles every year, coming back to the White House. And in fact, the joke is that the first year, there was actually a headline in the Washington Post, Eleanor Roosevelt spends night in the White House. So that was quite, you know, she just was never there. And she had journalist friends who were always, she had this network that she built up very rapidly that exploded, so that her sense of what was happening in Nebraska or Minnesota or wherever, it came back to her, and she would funnel that back to the White House. So she influenced, I would say, but you know, it's hard to tell, because this is all, I wouldn't put it in the category of pillow talk, because she was more aggressive than that. But he, you know, I think she was she was a driving force behind a lot of these things in a backstory kind of way. And some of it comes out in My Day columns. I mean, you'll hear references to them in her thousands of My Day columns that she wrote every day, and some of them are awful, some of them are good. But you'll see kind of where her thinking was on a social justice issue.
So, I'm
sorry.
I have questions.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, the legacy, right? And we're talking about how the division has evolved and how you carry that mission and that mandate that we have to, again, enforce the human rights law and what the impact can be. And I think one of the areas where we're particularly proud of the Division of Human Rights is that beyond just individual actions, being able to actually represent an individual, adjudicate, investigate, prosecute a matter of discrimination, we also have a very critical unit called our Division Initiated Action Unit. And at the division, we have the ability to receive tips and investigate matters of discrimination that we identify as systemic, right? And when you're talking about really trying to change the narrative and correct bad behaviors and hold bad actors accountable, our ability to go beyond that one individual who comes forward is really important, right? So some examples of that, we had cases where we held a landlord and management company responsible and charged them penalty and fine, and also required them to do training because they were posting signs in the lobby that encouraged tenants to call ICE if you suspected that your neighbor might be here illegally, right? That is a case that we handled here at the division. We had a case where a young black girl was encountering consistent bullying on the bus, and yet there was absolutely no disciplinary action against any of the individuals, the children, but also the administrators had failed her. And so when we look at this young girl who's encountering bullying every single day on the way home from school, and you think about what that impacts, we know that's not just one girl, right? This is systemic, and this is indicative of a very pervasive problem. Our ability to go in and obviously address the individual harm, but also speak to the school administration and the board and have them do trainings and change their policies and monitor for compliance. So it's not a one and done, right? Because what we realize here is that you're talking about changing the narrative, but you're also talking about accountability. And accountability can't end when we walk out of the room or the stipulation or the settlement is signed. We have to go back and ensure that we're doing monitoring. So we have these cases where, I can say we're a small agency, we're under 300 individuals, but we're statewide, and we protect every single person in every corner of this state. But the ability to really do impactful work like that is something that I'm incredibly proud of. Because while it takes one person to come in, what we often realize is that when you peel the layers back, you realize that there's an entire community that's being disenfranchised in a very systemic way. Fire department, they were displaying Confederate flags. Let's talk about what the impact of that was for the community, and thought there was absolutely nothing wrong and couldn't understand why, right? And I will tell you, we're able to go in and do education and do training, but again, hold them accountable and teach them that these symbols that are rooted in racism and white supremacy do have impact within the community, and they do set up systems for discrimination, right? And so that's part of why I think the work of the division is so important, and allyship also.
That's critical, yeah. And none of those kinds of systems were in place in the Roosevelt years. I mean, there was just nothing.
And it sounds like, with division now, these systems are in place and, very broad to make this impact when there's systemic discrimination or wrongdoing. And it sounds like in Eleanor's time, she did that in some ways, but through networks to get that information back. So in similar ways, the networks, the allyship, the systemic piece was critical to people.
Except there was no legal codification with it, so without a legal structure and framework, there's really not much you can, you can make impact through talking to groups, clubs, women's associations. She was somebody pointed out she was an honorary member of the AKA, which was really kind of cool.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But, the problem is that then it's piecemeal. And that's really, and also, we don't think about this, but in the 30s, that was one of her main targets that she was really focusing on. Her friendship with Miranda, for example, was really, really important to her and important to the National Youth Administration. which is sort of was always kind of her focus, and she became, McLeod Bethune became the head of what they call it, the Negro division of the NYA, which became actually a very powerful part of the administration, one of the alphabet agencies. But also she, so, you know, the big struggle was against, in her mind, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was against systemic racism. But the fact that there was really nothing in place, I mean, they couldn't even get an anti-lynching bill passed. In fact, it didn't pass until 2005. But anyway, so, but that was just, we don't really understand, I think, now looking back, none of us remember, thank God, how bad it was. So she, I think, was just sort of chinking away. Sometimes they get this impression it's a big boulder here, you know, this civic injustice or civil injustice. And she's just chinking away at it through these allyships. But because there was no structure under place to tackle it and no laws, you know, it was hard to make headway.
It starts with allyship.
Yes,
right?
exactly. It starts there. Right.
It starts there, and that becomes the groundswell that actually leads to change and to laws, right? And we think about the legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt and, you know, the Tuskegee Airmen, right? And getting in that plane, and what that said to the communities and black people. Marian Anderson, right? Being refused to sing by the Georgia Revolution, right? And then being afforded the mall to sing, right? That allyship was met with support. And it was met with inspiration, and I think that's where it starts, right? And I think the lesson there for many of us is that everyone has a role to play. Whether you have an actual framework, a legal framework, everyone has an opportunity to speak up and do something within the capacity of the space that they hold.
That's right, exactly.
And that kind of pivots us, or moves us a little bit to the question, Anna, your great-grandmother led and helped shape the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What do you think she would say to us today? What would she urge us to do right now?
I think she would say, how have we progressed? I mean, you guess to sort of start at where she left off. Let's say she died in 1962. She'd have to sort of roll forward and see what has happened with politics since then, and the divisions that have happened and gotten worse and worse. And I think that she would say, look, you have to work within your communities, whether it's the state or your counties, and basically get down to kind of ground zero on where you are, and build spaces like this, you know, and so, because there's really, on a national level, where we are, we've been here for a while now. This is not just, you know, the current situation. We've been getting here to this place for a couple of decades. And so she'd say, you know, it's going to be hard to roll that back, and it's going to take a long time, but one of the ways to support civic society is to basically have places like this in your communities, have these codifications that you built in New York State, and the structure that you have to enforce these laws. That's, you know, that she'd say you just have to go back to where you are. And because that's your point of strength. Every community has a point of strength if it's a functioning community. This obviously is a well-functioning community thanks to all of your efforts. So that's, I think she'd be very proud, I want to say, of everything that you all have done here.
So we're talking about hate and bias. How has the division, what is the division, how is the division addressing hate and bias? And how did Eleanor Roosevelt address hate and bias?
So, under the leadership of Governor Kathy Hochul, the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit was created and is part of the Division of Human Rights. And the goal there is to promote anti-discrimination work, but also to address issues of hate and bias that exist in our communities, right? And we're seeing that uptick in real time in all of our communities right now. And so there are really 3 core pillars of the work that we do there at HBPU. We have 10 regional councils that represent every single community here in the state, and those are stakeholders that are locally based who are able to inform a lot of our policy conversations, as well as our priorities, right? So those are your local community heads, and we meet with them regularly, we convene with them, we're able to support programming and interventions in the community if necessary. We also have a youth component, young leaders component, where we're developing mentors and peers, right? Because we recognize that a lot of this work really hinges on the next generation, right? And so developing those skills and those leadership skills for them is really empowering, but also necessary. And then the third part of that is our response team. We have a response team, and so you're able to report incident of hate and bias to us at HVPU. And then we can support that individual with resources and referrals, given, depending on the circumstances, right? Some of those referrals may be for mental health services, some of them may be law enforcement referrals, because perhaps what someone perceives as an incident of hate and bias actually may rise to a criminal level, and so we're able to help walk people through that. But also sometimes there are opportunities for mediation, or education, or programming through the arts, right? And convening and using spaces like this, right, where we can actually promote dialogue in communities and hopefully diffuse the situation, but also provide education. And so the hate and bias work is really important to us at the division, because what we realize is that, of course, we're an enforcement agency, we deal with discrimination, but we really want to be part of the solution before it happens, right? And that's really about making impact and educating people, because when there's hate and bias, everyone loses, and that's what I say, right? It affects everybody. And so asking for communities to be engaged in this work is really important, but also relying on our partners in the street, right? And in the communities and in the neighborhoods, because that's where it happens. When you're talking about localization, but for the fact that New York is so rooted in these values, if we were relying on the federal protections, we'd really be in trouble. And I feel like we're in trouble already, right? So you really think about the impact of local government and how there are guardrails right now that are really protecting us, and but for those guardrails, where would we be? So local activism, that work, that engagement with the community is really critical.
So there are a couple of areas in which I wanted to touch on, and the Commissioner already talked a little bit about the Marian Anderson concert. So that was an interesting experience because, and the letters out there where she resigned her membership to the Daughters of the American Revolution, she worked with Harry Hopkins, it was not Hopkins, it was the Secretary of the Interior at the time, his name is slipping my mind, to find very quickly, because this is Easter Sunday, the concert was scheduled for that, and there was not a big enough space, basically. If it wasn't in Constitution Hall, where else could it be? So this space, and for Washingtonians, a space because it's also Martin Luther King gave his speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It's now what we call almost a sacred space. And that was the first time at this space for Marian Anderson, who was a contralto, beautiful voice, trained opera singer, trained in Europe, and she gave this incredible concert. So she later went on, also just people don't know this, to sing for the King and Queen in the White House, and when they visited later. But the other one is more serious in terms of just its, in terms of her bitterness, I think, is the subject of the Japanese internment camps. Because that was something, an area, and I use the word bitter on purpose because she really felt like she failed to prevent that from happening. And there was a lot of arguments going on. This is obviously a major case of hate and bias. But if FDR at some point just said, I can't oppose this, for political reasons, and all kinds of, the buck stopped at his desk. I'm not passing the buck to Western senators. He said, we have to do this, and we have to stop talking about it. So once it had happened, and the camps had been established, she made a point of going out to visit the Japanese internees, talking to them, looking at conditions, seeing what she could do, and also began lobbying after a year or two for early release. And some of that worked, some of that didn't. There was also a great deal of bias, and you also touched on it with the Tuskegee Airmen. Of course, they were not going to integrate the Army during World War II. That just was not going to happen. But there was also huge resistance to even training black pilots. And it was because she was also, again, we talk about allyship, she was on a board, the Rosenwald board. They provided the money. This is a Chicago-based foundation to build the airstrips, because he could not, FDR, the Army would not build the airstrips to train the pilots on. So therefore, they wouldn't, there's no go, right? So airstrips finally get built, and she says, well, look, we got to keep them, we got to get these guys going, we got to give publicity to it. She goes down there, and she gets in the plane, and the Secret Service agents are having a fit. And they call up FDR and they say, well, what are we going to do? He says, I can't stop her right now. So let her go. So there's this great photograph of her, this just grinning. She just is, and somebody asked her later, said, were you worried up there, with this pilot? She said, he wanted to get home to his family as much as I did. So it was just, she had a way of just kind of tackling issues that were hard, sort of in-your-face hate and bias like that, in those examples. Just take them on and just wrestling them to the ground. And she did what she had to do to make her point. And she made sure there were a lot of pictures of her sitting behind that pilot. They were an amazing Air Corps, as we all know.
So again, examples of using the platform or anything at your disposal that you have access to, whether it be that local community, the county, the state,
a foundation,
allyship,
right?
Utilizing your sphere to make a change and do something in the face of hate and bias, for example.
Yeah.
Wow, just really powerful to hear. I mean, I'm in this kind of every day, but this is just another level of human rights lore. So when we talk about policy, and we've been touching on that here and there, both of you have, how did Eleanor Roosevelt use her influence for policy change at the federal level, and how does DHR, the New York State Division of Human Rights, educate New Yorkers around policy change at the New York State level?
Sorry. So with respect to, the commitment that we have, a huge part of our work is also education and outreach. And you see some of our folks here in the back. I'm extremely proud and grateful for the work that we do. But I will say that it's really through the investment that the governor has made at the Division of Human Rights, which has nearly doubled our budget under this governor's administration. We've really been able to cultivate a cohort of individuals who are going out and really speaking to communities everywhere. Because we realize that there's incredible diversity here in New York State, but there's also a wide range of access to information, right? And there are parts of New York where we really need to make sure that we have individuals going out there and engaging with communities that are not comfortable walking into public spaces, right? And so that mission and that mandate of education and outreach is necessary because number one, it informs communities, it empowers communities, but also it's an opportunity for us to learn. So many times, we go out with the intentions of educating and doing outreach, but we are receiving a lot of information with respect to, again, systemic issues or policy issues, or places that really we need to come back and think about how can we effectuate change here, right? Is this worthy of a legislative proposal? Are there opportunities here for us to look at how this living, breathing law called the Human Rights Law can potentially fill a void that someone exists, that someone's feeling, right? And so education and outreach and really making sure that you're engaging in the community is the only way for us to stay connected. It's also the only way for people to know that they can reach us and understand what it is that we do, right? There are many people, you would be surprised, who actually do not believe, especially given the narrative and the rhetoric that we hear, that discrimination is still illegal in New York, right? Because it's seemingly very legal and very much on trend at a national level. And so making sure that we have an opportunity to provide that information and to hear what people are encountering and how it's manifesting, right? Recently, there were amendments to the law where we are now able to deal with appraisal bias, right? And that is a very real form of discrimination, right? And that is a product of policy, that's a product of education, that's a product of outreach, and understanding that for many families, right, a home provides generational wealth. Well, if my home is valued $200,000 less than your home because I'm a woman of color and I live in a certain community, that is disenfranchisement in a way that we really can't make up, right? And so for people to understand that the Division of Human Rights is here to address those issues and that we are actually prepared to investigate those claims, that's important. But that comes from what we're hearing from the community and how we're seeing discrimination how it's manifesting in a lot of the communities throughout the state.
I think that a lot of her influence in terms of legislation would have happened really during the 30s. One thing that happened in the war years is that she had to take a back seat. She did one important thing. Let me skip over the 30s and get to her visit to the South Pacific, because there was a very specific reason for her to go. This was in August of '43. She spent about, 5 to 6 weeks touring the areas where the Marines and were mostly Marines were in Guadalcanal, all the islands in the Pacific, where we were pushing back against the Japanese. One of the things she said was, when I come back and reporting back to FDR, these are the things that these troops are doing, and when they get out of the service, we need to have some arrangement. We need to figure out what to do with these servicemen. We need to figure out, and he was thinking of this too, it wasn't just her. But it was really, so in terms of influencing and bringing information to him that was real, that was not just coming from his generals where everything is filtered, she was really visiting the troops and saying, this is what they're experiencing, these are how, and no one used the term PTSD back then, but she could tell that these are people who are going to need a lot of help when they got out. They got some help, maybe not in terms of mental health as much as, and that has been a persistent problem. But I just want to get to that part, because that's not really talked about. That was a very significant contribution she made, I think, to the GI Bill. Because, and again, behind the scenes, this is just sort of this is what we should be doing. And that was an important human rights, because in terms of asking people to do, and we're Cavaliers, we know now a little bit about this, about protecting soldiers' lives, I think. But that was not something, that was her real contribution, I think, to the war effort in that sense. During the 30s, one of the things that was happening was we got closer and closer to realizing that we needed to get into this war. All the alphabet agencies, the WPA, all the federal writers projects, the big murals that you see in post offices, all of that was shriveling because suddenly the money was drying up. We've got to turn the taps off on these programs. She fought as long as she could in all communities, and that was one of the things she was saying, was very adamant about. We need to give access to that money for artists from all communities of color, of everywhere. So you see, I think Ben Shahn, for example. I mean, they're just, I'm just trying to think, Gordon Parks. There's several, now I can't think of these names, but there are people that are household names in the arts world now. And they would not have been, we wouldn't know about them if it wasn't for, those agencies and her continuing to push for them to be continued as long as possible through 1940. So that, that's one direct influence I see on our cultural life, which is important for us to enjoy. You see the gym outside, right?
Before we sat down to have this conversation, we toured the gym here at the Family Partnership Center, and there's beautiful murals that were made by students in an art program all around the gym. And we were struck with how beautiful they were and impactful they were. So when you talk about culture and access, it matters.
And it's a human right to enjoy art and to create art.
Absolutely. Not just basic needs of living, culture, art. So let's talk for a minute, or more than a minute, but what makes the human rights law the strongest in the country?
I think when you talk about 19 protected classes, that's a pretty long list. I won't attempt to recite them all, but I can tell you that New York leads when it comes to the number of protected classes that include gender, national origin, religion, pregnancy, domestic violence status, veteran status, the list goes on, gender expression, age. We're talking about every single New Yorker. When we're talking about this narrative also, on a federal level, which I think a lot of it is being driven by sort of white male cisgender, individuals who are saying, what about me? What about me? And I often say, you do realize that the human rights law protects you also, right? We have cases, white men who've experienced discrimination, and we investigate those cases, we prosecute those cases, and we adjudicate those cases. Because at the end of the day, the human rights law is the human rights law. And every single New Yorker falls into one of those, if not several of those protected categories, right? And so ensuring that people understand that it's not about them, that they need to be invested in human rights, that they need to be invested in the protections that protect them at work, in housing, in education, and in public accommodation, that is really important. And when you make that point, oftentimes I see the sort of light bulb go off. It's like, oh, this isn't just DEI for the others or protection for someone else. No, this is ensuring that you have equal access, irrespective of what you look like, what language you speak, what religion you speak, and you would be surprised the diversity of the people who come to us, right? And we represent them all with the same degree of, enthusiasm and commitment and integrity. And I think that's something that's really important right now, because I think the conversation about civil rights as being something that is only applicable to women and people of color. And I don't really have any value as a narrative we have to change. If not, we're really going to see the comeback from this as much more difficult and with many more obstacles.
And where do you see future protections being expanded?
I think there's an interesting dynamic going on right now, I think, when we're talking about immigrant communities, right? And national origin and citizenship are protected. So I want to make that clear in New York State's human rights law. National origin language also gets protected vis-a-vis national origin. But I think in terms of thinking about how we expand that and what that looks like, right? And how we ensure that people recognize those laws exist, I think there's a lot of work there we can do, especially given the focus now on immigrant communities, right? And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think we continue to hear from communities, and the best ideas come from the people who are impacted by them. What I will say is that this governor has been committed, as I mentioned, to amending the human rights law to make sure that as we evolve as a society, as we see trends, that we really look at how those manifest and how do we make sure we're not leaving anyone behind, right? So when we're talking about gender expression, right, that was just a couple of years ago, right? And how important that is for the LGBTQIA+ community in New York, considering the hostility, and hostility is a mild word, that they are encountering every single day, right? And again, those guardrails that New York has put up, they didn't exist 6, 7, 10 years ago, right? So it is really through the advocacy, right, that the policies and the laws actually come to fruition, and I think that's really important. To continue to do sessions like this, where we hear and we learn and we take back these ideas.
Yeah, the other thing I just want to point out, I think Rick Governor appreciated this, and not enough people, certainly in her day, very few people appreciated the fact that when you have the dynamic that you're describing, where people feel safe and they feel like they are in a space where they're appreciated too for who they are and what they stand for, we have a much richer society. And people just don't stop and think, they just don't think about that enough. And I think it frustrated her a lot to realize that was often the case, especially in the 50s. But she did not like the 50s. That's another subject.
Okay. So I just want to follow up on that a little bit, Commissioner. For individuals who may feel like they're not getting protected federally, and they're not. You've been talking about the protections here in New York, immigration status, national origin. What can we do to continue to get that message out and to ensure people feel like New York is protecting them?
So, we, as you mentioned, during the bio, we really have invested in modernization and a revamping of the agency. Right, and one of the first areas of priority when I arrived at HR was really to look at our intake model, right? And operations matter, right? And it may not be as sexy as talking about sometimes human rights, but if people can't access, right? If people can't access the information, if the process is so cumbersome that it is a deterrent, then the law doesn't have the value that it's intended to have, right? And so we revamped our entire process, and we've made significant investment to make sure that every New Yorker has an opportunity to call and speak with an individual one of our call center representatives, who will walk them through the process, inform them what they need in order to file a report, will give them information, provide context, right? So that that person is not only educated and empowered, but that person also has an ability to ask a question. And I can certainly say, you know, we're living in a world where everything is automated. The ability to actually reach someone and make sure that there's accessibility, language, and everything else is included. Making sure that accessibility exists is really important. Making sure that there's an online form that is also available. And looking again at that through the lens of accessibility and the various populations that we serve, that's particularly important, right? So, you know, making sure that the laws exist, obviously important in protecting those, but making sure that people know how to access them, making sure that they know about the center, making sure that they know that they can call someone, making sure that if those two modes don't work, that they can reach us and we will figure out what necessary accommodation is necessary, right? And we will implement that. I think that's as critical as making sure that the laws are there, because if you can't access them, if you don't know where they are, if you don't know who to call, if you don't know what information you need to file a report, that you're gonna need your employer's information, you're gonna need, right, that tax ID number, you're gonna need an address. Then those laws don't exist and they don't protect me.
I have to say, I love that call-in center. I tell people all the time when that's what they want to file a complaint, they can do it online, but they also call center, and people really love that.
And we have information here at the back with respect to how to, you know, the phone number and some flyers and cards and QR code and all the things. And it's a work in progress, I will say also, right? Because we just launched this call center last summer. And so we're learning, right, how to make sure that the process, again, is accessible, and making sure that we're also working through the operational efficiencies to make sure that once we get your case and it is converted into a complaint, that we have the staffing and resources to move that case along, right? Because it is a lengthy process, and we realize that, you know, justice delayed is justice denied, but people need answers and they need closure and they need resolution. And so trying to make sure that we are being good stewards of the investment that's been made, recognizing the importance of the work, and how many people rely on us. You know, we're talking about thousands of complaints that are coming in every single year. And every one of those complaints represents and impacts the family, whether it's with respect to their employment or their home or their living situation, the communities that they're able to live in, right? Which we spoke about, I think, downstairs in terms of, you know, how access, where you live, provides access to banking or education or library. When you think about those ramifications and the impact it can have, it's not just about, can I get this apartment? It's about, will my child have programming, schooling, a library, and all the things that come from the community.
Okay, and people are very happy to hear about the call center.
And I'm very excited to hear that too.
And so, how does the mission of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center, which you're the board chair, how does the mission of the center, how are you keeping her legacy alive?
So it's interesting, great question. I was talking to a board member this afternoon who reminded me of something. I already knew this, but it goes back to her legacy and her continued sort of through line of interest in young people. And basically, when young people define that a little better, it's really high school age, college age. Although back then in her time, many young people did not go on to college. So it was more about our mission, in terms of your question, assisting the young people in this community, and we are, you know, selecting the schools to work with them for workforce readiness training, placing them in internships, teaching them leadership skills, sort of in Eleanor Roosevelt style, and trying to sort of bring them into this mode where they are learning what did she value, for one thing. That's going to be part of this, to learn about her. But then taking it from there into practical reality of how to launch kids. I mean, we're talking about teenagers who aren't sure what they're going to do, and we're giving them options. And we're saying, you know, you can do this, you can do that. Give them a sense of agency. That is part of, and we're working with a select group of people, we will be, of kids who've expressed interest, who we will work with on a continuing basis. So that's the modernization of a previous program that we had going for many years that took girls from all over the world, actually. And we decided that we need to be gender neutral for one thing, And I think that's the direction we're going in. That's where we are moving.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it.
Okay, so, here's the big question. Individuals and communities, what can schools, families, and young people, this is for both of you, schools, families, young people do to protect human rights in their own communities? What does courageous allyship look like in practice? If each person in this room or online could do just one thing after leaving tonight to advance human rights, what would you suggest?
Small and consistent steps.
Yeah.
You know, I often say, nothing changes if nothing changes.
Right.
Right? Nothing changes if nothing changes. My other favorite saying, which people are tired of hearing me say, is important things get treated with importance. Right? So if this is important, then we need to treat it with importance. That means we can't stay silent. That means we have to be comfortable making people uncomfortable. And sometimes those are people we love that are uncomfortable. But we do have to remain committed to ensuring that people know that we can do better and we should do better, right? And that's allyship. When we talk about, I think, the capacity for preserving human rights and civil rights, you don't need a law degree. You don't need a law degree. You don't need anything other than a commitment and a desire to preserve something that you recognize as essential to your freedom, your dignity, and your right to exist. And that's why I think, you know, I always say, we can all do something. Speak up. Speak up, say something.
Yeah. And so I said something earlier about the 1950s because I think that Eleanor really had a feeling that people, again, college students, high school students, were sort of sinking back into this complacency. We'd won the war, everything was fine, nothing, we didn't need to challenge the status quo, and she was very discouraged with that because McCarthy was, you know, roaming the land with his accusations, and she saw the damage that these charges were bringing to people that she loved. So she would say, to answer that question, get out there and vote for one thing, learn about the candidate's background, go to work for him or her if you can, but most of all, talk to the other people in your circles, especially if you're 16, you can pre-register in New York State, that's amazing, and make sure that pre-registered student votes when he or she is 18. Because that is the main thing, she said, you know, and she would look at our voting levels now for that age cohort and just be appalled. This is not democracy. You are losing your democracy when people are not voting. And they don't understand who they're voting for. And so you don't understand who you're voting for unless you're talking and really reading quality newspapers, not your phone. And she would say, that's, you know, that's we are neglecting our basic duty to democracy by not voting. And not understanding who we're voting for.
Let that sink in. Okay. So as we wrap up, and we're going to move into Q&A, if a couple of things. If Eleanor were sitting here with us tonight, what do you think she'd ask us?
I think she would say, think of top 3 issues that bother you the most, because I mean, I know that voting would be one thing on her plate, but what's on your plate? What are the elements in your life that are a challenge for you? Because if they're a challenge for you, they're stopping you. Look at those issues and say, what can I do about them? Maybe I can't take on 3 issues, but pick one then. And you go and you make an ally with a group or friends or an organization that tackles the issue that you care most about, because then it means you will do something. You will actually become engaged in an outward way with a social justice issue or a civic engagement issue, whatever it is. It could be food, it could be housing. But it is something you, as a person, if you don't work to keep democracy going, it's just going to die on the vine. And she says, and getting back to the 50s, that's what she was afraid was happening. So it's very interesting that we're still, you know, we're having this discussion again.
I think she'd give us a pat on the back. Give us a pat on the back and say that New Yorkers are protected, but I think she would then challenge us and ask us whether New Yorkers feel protected. Right? And And there is a big distinction there.
Mhm.
And I think that's our marching order, right?
Exactly.
Any last comments either one of you would like to make before we open the Q&A?
I just think this is a marvelous opportunity that I've had to have both of you to share this information, and I am just really, there's so much more I'd like to talk about too, about the success of states that did what New York did with the, essentially a Bill of Rights. And, so there's a lot left to talk about, but this is a great idea.
Commissioner, anything else?
No, I'm excited to hear.
Questions? Okay, so let's, and we're gonna, so first let's thank you to Commissioner Miranda, thank you to Okay, and so we have a microphone so we can hear your questions. So please, who has a question?
I have to say that I've spent maybe 50, 60 years working with human rights.
Okay, and your question?
Yes, I've spent half a century as a journalist working on issues of human rights that have been abused in other countries. I'll say it. I'm also a born native New Yorker. And are you actually telling me that there is human rights law in New York State?
Yes, I'm definitely telling you.
Because I have never known that.
Right. So
And to what extent can you exert this law to prevent horrific injustices from being perpetuated? Because, as we unfortunately all know, too many people who should be enforcing human rights law can be bought.
So the human rights law that exists here in New York, as I mentioned, celebrated 80 years or 80-year anniversary. We cover areas of jurisdiction, as I mentioned, employment discrimination, which is the bulk of our work, also housing, education, and public accommodation. I think the challenge for us sometimes in New York is that people equate that with civil rights, right? And in New York, it's called human rights. So I think there's sometimes, just an issue of nomenclature, right? In terms of associating human rights often on a more global, international context. But New York leads when we're talking about civil rights. And we adjudicate thousands of cases a year where we are, again, receiving a report. We investigate, we have investigators. We will then make a decision, a determination as to whether there's probable cause. That will go to a public hearing. And depending on the outcome of the hearing, the matter may be referred for settlement. There might be policy changes, there's civil fines, millions of dollars every year in civil fines and penalties, holding bad actors accountable. There's compliance as part of our work. And also, as I mentioned, those larger systemic cases, which are part of our division-initiated action unit. That's all here in New York. When we're talking here in New York, and we often hear about the Attorney General and the litigation she's filing, it is often based on the New York human rights law. That is the mechanism that is in place. So we also work with the Attorney General in terms of, again, being able to challenge some of the federal efforts that are being made to curtail human rights. So it's our civil rights law.
One more question I'd like to ask Anna. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is referred to and given lip service to at the United Nations. I've been working there for over a decade, I don't know. It's being given lip service to, but to what extent is it a form of empowerment? In other words, Article 19 is constantly violated, and the entire declaration doesn't have the force of law. And one of the reasons the United Nations is perceived as so ineffective, which it is because your great-grandmother's declaration is almost a fig leaf over an enormity of corruption that's permitted at the United Nations, and it's so scandalous. That's your name.
Yeah, I mean, the UDHR was out there, it has always been non-binding, it will remain non-binding. The one thing that I can't address the corruption of the United Nations, and she was voted out as a delegate when Eisenhower came in, as you know. So she left, yeah, she had to hand in her resignation papers. So anyway, how the UN has evolved, and you might say devolved over the decades, is a whole nother discussion. But what I see the value of the UDHR is it became the foundation for constitutions in many countries. Not all of the articles, but it became basically a tool for developing democracies. You could say, okay, this is what the 48 countries agreed upon, so let's take this. Now there was some, of course, cherry picking for articles. It also became the basis for the European Court of Human Rights, European Court of Justice. The Europeans developed their own conventions in 1950. They looked at what was developed 2 years earlier. That actually is a binding court, and it sits in The Hague. So there were some very significant developments that came out of this once it was in place. How it is used now, it's hard. It's basically used, I think, more in education on human rights. Because people will say, well, you talk to school children, and you have a great school program in Dutchess County. And one of the things they go back to is they use those elements to say these are the basic human rights that everybody could agree on after this, horrific World War. Everybody could agree on this. And so, it has moral authority still when you're teaching this to children and young adults. It becomes then, we hope, internalized, that this is a right I have. If you come from another country, you might say, well, I didn't know. That's a right of mine? Yes, it is. So I had to separate that out from the United Nations at this point, because of partly what, your statement, which I think may or may not be true. I can't go on the record as agreeing with you or disagreeing.
Yes, I want to make sure we get around to other people, but I did want to say something about the UDHR, and as you mentioned, non-binding. Our understanding, we felt a responsibility about this, being the Commission on Human Rights in the county, in Dutchess County, is that we want people to know that the UDHR exists, and we want them to know that Eleanor Roosevelt made her home here, and she championed that. She led that committee in 2 years to come up with these articles, this UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what Anne was alluding to was a conference that we host every year with high school students, and one of the workshops that they take is a dialogue workshop where they're talking about individual articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how they relate to issues today. Mm-hmm. And what the other point of that conference and that workshop is the understanding as foundational, like people didn't just think they had human rights. Right. Like we expect that we have human rights today because we're human, but that wasn't the way it was years ago, before World War II and after World War II. And this document really set that foundation that everybody has human rights. That was not the understanding. And it influenced in many different ways. So we have to make sure that people, that's why when we do this conference every year, and I'm going to stop, we felt it was a real responsibility to have students know where human rights even came from, or what foundational, and that here's a document, and here's, what does this mean to you today? What do these articles mean to you today? And of course, they talk about everything that's happening in the world today, and they have amazing conversation. So I'm going to stop there. Another question. Yes.
Hi, thank you for this incredible meeting tonight. I enjoyed the last two online, and then being here in person is also very meaningful. My question is related to, you wouldn't normally think of me necessarily as a target, as a middle-class white man. I have a fair amount of privileges, but as a Muslim man, I feel very unsafe. My wife is a legal citizen here now. but she's still terrified. She's worried. As she's one of the nasty people who we're bombing the hell out of across the sea right now, and she's from Morocco, and we're planning on going back in the summer to visit for a short period, and she's terrified that even though she has the U.S. passport, that the government's not going to let her back in, and how she's someone who's has privileges. She has all the legal documentation, but there are so many people that have even less rights, or not necessarily less rights, but less documentation, less verification, and how we can make us feel safe as we're facing the potential for more Muslim bans and excuse the language that shithole countries that we come from or are associated with, and how we can make it safe for everyone.
I will say this, and I'm sorry to hear that anyone is living with this degree of fear, right? Because that is where we are right now. That is unfortunately the reality. And when we see that United States citizens are being detained, right? I think it should cause us all to worry, irrespective of whether you feel you have papers, you are safe. I don't think anyone is safe in this construct right now. And I think it really takes all of us internalizing that and recognizing that any of us can get picked up to realize the state of emergency that we're in. And I have complete empathy. I have family members who I say you should really walk around with your papers. And they're U.S. citizens. But can I really tell them with the greatest assurance that, you're fine, don't worry about it, you're a citizen, your mother's a citizen, your grandparents were citizens? Not if you look a certain way, or if you encounter the wrong person, where they don't even care. We have stories about, veterans who served our country who are being detained. So what do you say to someone who perhaps is readily identifiable as a minority, or as a person who ICE has targeted? We're in dangerous times, and I'll say that we're in dangerous times, and I think we all have to be invested in the solution, and we all need to be invested in the recovery. And anyone who believes that this can't impact them is really in a state of denial.
I have a question for Anna. I was privileged to listen to a lecture recently, and I found out about an organization, a long-standing organization called the International Federation of University Women. And we were privileged at that time, not we, because I'm not that old, but they had a conference here at Vassar College that included representatives from 40 countries around the world. The lecture that I attended, the researcher found an invitation to Eleanor to attend that conference. Wow. And I'm wondering, and we talk about allyship. Here are women representing 40 countries from around the world. And I'm wondering if you know if she attended, and what is her connection with that particular organization?
Well, there's two organizations. It's not the American University Association of University Women. So, because this is all of these.
It's not AUW. It's a
Yeah, it's an international organization. Only one was International League of Peace and Freedom. She was involved in that. That started in around 1918. But I don't know the organization you were talking about. And she didn't go to college. So if it was University Women, she would have got an invitation as the First Lady maybe. So it didn't matter that she didn't go to college. But I don't know whether she did come up to Vassar, or obviously she was here a lot. And she probably spoke at this meeting.
Well, the professor who gave the lecture wants to know. He could not find documentation, so I said I'd ask you.
Yeah, I mean, she got invitations, probably hundreds a week, and so And, you know, many of them were just, she had an incredible secretary. She had a shorthand. The secretary would answer, you know, say no, or say yes, or question mark, and would go back. And, you know, they have boxes that go up to the ceiling in the library that many of them are not digitized, that have all these responses. So it would be impossible for me to tell, you know, I'm sure he would like to know, but thank you.
And just thinking, when you spoke about the importance of alliances,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, well, those are delicate times too. But, because we're talking about the late 40s, the late 30s, early 40s. Just thinking about the kind of alliances she might have had with that particular organization, which, by the way, has changed its name. It still exists today, but it's under a new name. I really don't remember what it is.
So it's International League of University Women?
International Federation of University Women.
Oh, National Federation.
That's the old name.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, she spoke, she gave hundreds of speeches a year, so she could have very easily, if it was at Vassar, spoken here, but to find her letter of acceptance, it's a needle in the haystack.
I figured if anybody would know, you'd know.
You're giving me too much credit for that.
You earned it.
Thank you, ladies, for being here. Recently, the SAVE Act was passed in the House, and it's being debated still in the Senate, apparently. Now, what role does this organization hope to assist certain members of our community, especially the elderly? Because this seemed to be impinging on the Voter Registration Act of '93. And as we know, in our community, we have quite a number of elderly people who have no way of finding their birth certificates. So if this is one form of identification that is necessary in order for them to vote, how are they going to maneuver and navigate this recommendation? Or this?
I mean, the state.
So what I will say is I think New York State is keenly aware of the implications for residents here. And I think, again, that legacy of progressive values and protecting democracy and access to democracy, I think, should that come to pass, I think we will immediately see action from the state. And so, again, this is where we talk about the importance of state safeguards, right? And ensuring that you're in a state that will respond to situations where there is a federal attempt at curtailing access to people to vote.
The more likely one is mail-in ballots, which is probably going to be, the Supreme Court is probably going to decide for canceling out mail-in ballots, which would then, basically be an education chore for the state. You're going to have to do huge blasts, which won't happen in many states. Many states will be just, oh, wait a minute, I can't mail this 2 days before?
No problem.
Right. Yeah, no, your ballot won't count. So I don't think the SAVE Act is going to pass. I mean, I live in Washington, so I read I just absorb all that. I don't think it's going to pass unless they get it right. Yeah.
But I think, Commissioner Miranda, what you're saying about the state, when something happens at the federal level, the state, because of the progressive values that it holds, steps in and tries to address in some way that harm, so that New Yorkers are protected as much as possible. Another question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for being here as well. So I'm a clinician here in Dutchess County. As a social worker, I have even children as young as 11-year-old that are afraid of ICE, are afraid of the situation that's going on. They get bullied by their peers because of this, telling them that if they have a green card or not, that they have to, that they're going to call ICE on them. As young as 11 years old. Now, I would like to know, I understand that we already discussed a little bit about that, and we all know that, yes, we have to be privy that it's a situation that entails, something that has to do with all, of the United States. But what exactly is the human rights, law protecting when it comes to the people that are being targeted, in this, situation? And if so, is there communication with other states that also have the human rights, law in place for things to be in place to help these people so this doesn't continue, because it's abusive, it's, again, a violation to human rights, a lot of things that are happening, and being that ICE is federal, then what is in place that we're going to be doing, to help this situation?
So I think there are a couple of parts that I want to make sure I touch on. Number one, as it relates to the human rights law and national origin and citizenship, that is one of the protected classes, right? But our jurisdiction is relatively narrow. When you're talking about instances where children are being bullied and harassed or threatened with ICE, that is also an incident paid by ICE, right? And you can call us in and we can discuss what the possible remedies are and the resources are. We also partner with the Office of New Americans to really also make sure that we are promoting information and know your rights sessions so that people know what their rights are for when ICE does come, right? Because ICE has now become an epidemic and it manifests in very different ways. It's being weaponized, right? As you mentioned, I think I spoke about this earlier when we spoke about a building and a management company putting up a sign and saying, call ICE on your neighbor, right? We see it in the employment context. You're gonna stay and work overtime or else I'm gonna call ICE, right? And how that's being leveraged for theft of wages, etc. And so we know that besides the actual presence of ICE, it's being weaponized in a way and people are abusing it. So I think, if you're encountering that situation, what my recommendation would be to please reach out to us, right? And in particular to our hate and bias group, where we can actually sort of flesh out some of the facts there, see what we can do to come into the community and provide some resources, perhaps connect with the Office of New Americans so we can also promote some education and outreach, and also make sure that we're doing it in an accessible way. So what we found is that when we're often dealing with communities, immigrant communities, there is a real fear to come out, and that is understandable. And so we're partnering with local organizations and commissions and nonprofits and CBOs because they are the valued and trusted entities in the community. So we're happy to meet the community wherever they are, and that is part of our modality in terms of bringing information. So perhaps that's a Zoom, where no one has to leave their home, right, and where people can feel safe. And we can partner with a local CBO and provide information, what to do in that particular context, what referrals and what resources are available. But I do know, and I appreciate we're seeing that concern and how ICE is being thrown out as a threat in so many different contexts, and it's particularly harmful when it's in the context of children and education. But I think there's more conversation there because depending on where it's happening, and if it's happening in a school setting, and the administration, how they're responding, that may or may not put it in play with respect to our jurisdiction for discrimination, right? You're talking about disparate discipline, which is something we spoke about a little bit earlier. So they're very fact specific. So I would encourage, for there to be some reach out and we can connect and talk about the specificity.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Oh, in the back. In the back. Here's a question.
Hi, how's it going? So I feel like the answers to my question were probably touched on at a few different points in the discussion and everything, but as we close to the end of the discussion, it's just worth touching on again. It feels like we live in a time where basic human rights are not just being demolished. It feels like there's an effort to make them feel abstract and even taboo and everything like that. And it seems like so many people in positions of power and just everyday life are being emboldened through division and everything like that. And it feels like it just gets tougher and tougher to reach so many of these people. And to be honest, it's frustrating. I want to run up on people and grab them by the shoulders and just shake them like a fruit tree, and I can't do that. And I'm very okay with taking the long way around to do the right thing. But I wonder how in a year of 2026, where everything's just getting so much more complicated and muddled and multi-layered, what do everyday efforts of just an individual like me or anybody else in this room look like to reach people? You know, I like to, you know, I vote, I like to show up in person, I like to be there for my community. I have no problem getting loud for people who might not want to get loud. But I'm just wondering, what are some efforts that I can do or anybody else in here can do that we can hopefully see compounding interest on those efforts as time goes by? Because it feels like the clock is ticking on some of these issues and people are just only...
And there was a question we had earlier about hope and how can we have hope in this time. And I just wanted to point out a fabulous article by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times about what happened in Minnesota. He's a Minnesotan, so he he spent time out there, went back to visit family. And we all remember, of course, no, they're not in the news anymore, but we do remember now, it's happened a few months ago, how they basically managed to get ICE, more or less, not totally gone, out of their community. And they did that through concerted action on the part of thousands of people who are faceless, nameless, will never know who they are, as he said. But altogether, these thousands of Minnesotans created a social safety net for all the people who were threatened there. And so, you know, just, I think it's more a question, they had it in their face, so they had to get mobilized and organized to save the Somalis, to save all the people, you know, the Hispanic group, Laotians, everybody who was being thrown out. We can, when people act in concerted effort, we can make a difference to get that particular element, which was extremely threatening, obviously, out of their city, St. Paul, Minneapolis. So it can happen. I feel like we aren't in the same situation, fortunately, here, where it's an omnipresent, it's just, you know, it's like a storm cloud in our faces all the time. So you don't have that same kind of impetus. But I think in small and large ways, keep doing what you're doing, because what else are you going to do? I mean, you can't shake them like a fruit tree. Don't go there. Why don't you stick around? But still, I think it's hard to judge what small actions do in the long run, and you feel still like you're not doing enough. You are doing enough if you are engaged with an area of that, you know, where you're helping. So.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about Minnesota, right, and the impact that had, and where we were and where we are now. Right. That is proof positive of advocacy and everyday citizens going out and saying we've had enough. I also look at the midterm elections and the turnout, and that gives me hope. I look at what's happened in New York City and just the record turnouts, irrespective of who you may have voted for or who you may support. The level of civic engagement gives me hope. And while I agree, do not shake people who do not want to be shaken, I do think that we all have people in our circle who are kind of asleep at the wheel. Yeah. Those are the ones we should shake, right? The ones, our friends and family, who are kind of oblivious or, you know, displaying apathy towards this. It doesn't really affect me. Those are the ones you give a loving shake and say that this does affect you. And you try to get them engaged, because the bottom line is that we have to remain engaged, we have to remain educated, and we have to go out and vote. And there are still people, even now, considering where we are, who just don't understand why it's important to vote. And the world is falling apart in many ways, but there are still young people like you who are going out here and saying, this is not what I signed up for, what can I do? And I think that's really important, and I want to commend you for that, because it is very easy to just sit back and think that it's someone else's problem. But it's the combination of all of us in this room that keeps the conversation alive, and it's also what's giving rise to a lot of engagement for people who have not been engaged in a long time, who just really didn't feel connected to the issues, and now they are connected in a way that they've never experienced.
So we do have one more?
Yes. Yes.
Sorry. I'm a senior in high school, and I feel like, I don't know if this works, but like, I feel like I'm lucky enough to be put in like substantial conversations like this, but like I feel like it's hard to like gain access to like information like this, other than like, because as someone, I've been through U.S. history and like AP U.S. history and courses like that, like bigger courses, and I feel like human rights laws are not talked about or like put in like conversation like that to actually educate upon in schools especially. And I feel like, I mean, my question is just like, how can I like, not me specifically, but how can like this human rights laws and topics like this not be considered taboo? Like I feel like the ICE topic in school is a topic that like we just don't talk about in general, because I feel like it's just too like broad to the point where like it gets into like we're not allowed to talk about it because it can be seen as argumentative or stuff like that. And I feel like the question is like, how can I like touch on these topics more and like even put people in spaces like this, because I'm lucky enough to have been put in a space like this. But how can I like, I don't know if I got a phrase, but how can this be like, how can more people be educated on this, like the youth especially?
So I believe this is being recorded, right? And I think that's an incredible way to share information. I want to also encourage everyone to please connect with our social media. We have seen an explosion in our social media in terms of engagement and really reaching demographics that we haven't reached before. And we're talking about human rights in a way that's creative, that resonates with the young people, and that really drives the message home. And so please feel free to follow us on Facebook, on Instagram. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, I'm sure a couple of other things back there that our folks can share. But in terms of, I'll say this, I have a 24-year-old daughter. And she was like, oh, this is pretty cool. I was like, okay, if you think civil rights is pretty cool based on how we're giving you this information, then we're doing something right? And if you're sharing it with your friends and we're seeing that young people are commenting and liking, and we're getting traction, we're looking at the demographic data, and people are learning their rights in ways that are informative but also speak to them in the language in which we speak to them, then I think that's also a way that you can tap into your group, right? And I welcome you to please check it out, because I'm really excited about the work that our social media and our comms team is doing to make sure that human rights and civil rights is relatable, right? That we're not talking about, you know, a statute and, you know, some text that no one wants to read.
Do you have a website?
We have a website. We absolutely, all of the information, and Peyton's going to give all of that out, but go to our website. But as I mentioned, our social media is really fun, it's interactive, and it's really driving a message home in a way that hits with people in a way that perhaps we haven't always explored in the past.
Yeah, is there a civic engagement classes in your high school? Because that's supposed to be something the governor has asked high schools in New York State to start teaching civic engagement. And I know it's kind of, it's happening, but not maybe as fast as I would like to see it happen. But that would be actually the kind of class where you could say, I mean, human rights is about engaging with your community on an equal basis, right? And respecting everyone. So I don't know in your school whether this is an option.
Government would consider like.
Well, government civic engagement, I'm not sure what right, it's supposed to be taught, right? Yeah. And so, you know, essentially, human rights are part of good governance. So to me, that could be, if the curriculum is designed right, and that's something you can actually maybe push for and make some noise about, is that this ought to be part of the curriculum for that course.
And the commission, I mean, and your local commission.
Right.
Yes, we're happy to come and talk to people. Anyway, but also, there are copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, booklets here. I know that's, you know, hard copies. But you can take them back to your school and ask your government teacher to allow you to have a dialogue in class.
Right.
Where does this fit in? Here's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't know where, I'm sure they can fit it in somewhere. Can your classmates have a dialogue about, pick one, there's 30 articles, and have a discussion about current events?
Or maybe even advocate for a human rights club at your school.
Right.
Something you can do after class, something you can do ninth period, and get more and more students from all the grades involved, and get a teacher that wants to help facilitate that. That would also help, because then the students get more involved with solving human rights issues in your own school, in your own community. And I think that a couple of schools have done that, and it's been successful. So I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
And so I want to give a shout out to my colleague here, Joe McDonald, who is the Ulster County Human Rights Commissioner. And my colleague Kathleen Harrison, also from Ulster County Human Rights Commission. And I would just like to ask our commission members, as I mentioned, there are several of them here tonight, if you could just, can you stand? Gwen?
He's standing.
So I want to again thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Miranda. It was fabulous. Anna, it was fabulous. Thank you so much. And everybody here is going to do something for human rights when you leave. Yes?
How are you?